The sun was setting, casting a dim glow over the farmhouse. Inside, the air felt heavy, thick with the weight of years of bitterness. In the dim light, the family gathered around the dinner table. A silence lingered, more deafening than any words. The old wooden floor creaked underfoot. The faint smell of dust mingled with the aroma of cooked meat, but no one seemed to notice. Eyes avoided contact, and hearts raced with a silent, shared tension. The youngest son sat at the far end, his hands trembling. His eyes darted nervously to the kitchen door, knowing what was coming. He could hear the distant sound of heavy boots approaching. The door creaked open, and there he stood, his uncle. The man's presence filled the room like a storm. There was a history between them, one that couldn't be undone. He was the one who had betrayed them all, who had cost them everything. The room felt smaller with every passing second. The uncle's glare cut through the silence, and his lips curled into a twisted smirk. The father, sitting at the head of the table, clenched his fists. The older brother spoke first, his voice low, strained. "Enough of this," he muttered. "We've been fighting for too long." The air grew colder, the walls closing in. The uncle's laugh echoed in the room. It was chilling. The tension was suffocating now. The youngest son couldn't breathe, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. Then, without warning, the uncle lunged forward. His hand slammed down on the table with a force that made the dishes rattle. Everyone froze. The father's face turned white. "You think I'll let you take everything from me?" the uncle growled. The sound of a gunshot broke the silence, the sharp crack of metal cutting through the room. The youngest son's heart stopped. He couldn't move. A sharp pain spread across his chest as he looked down at the blood staining his shirt. He didn't understand what was happening. The room erupted in chaos. Shouts. Screams. The sound of furniture being overturned. He tried to stand, but his legs gave out. He collapsed to the floor, his vision blurring. The world around him spun, and the sounds faded. Everything was quiet. Too quiet. And then there was nothing. The stillness was suffocating. He blinked, struggling to focus, but his body felt numb. The pain in his chest was unbearable now. His vision flickered, the shadows of people moving around him. He could hear footsteps, rapid and frantic. A voice, distant and muffled, called his name. But it felt like it came from another world. His uncle was standing in the doorway, his face a twisted mask of anger and madness. The father was on the ground beside him, blood pooling around his body. The youngest son's mind was clouded, the world slipping further away. He could hear someone crying, the sound strangled with grief. The walls seemed to close in tighter, as though the house itself was choking on its dark history. The once familiar place, filled with memories of childhood laughter, now felt like a tomb. Everything had changed in a single moment. The eldest brother was kneeling, his hand trembling as he reached for the youngest son. But it was too late. The youngest son could barely feel his brother's touch. His breath was shallow now, his pulse weakening. His eyes began to drift, and all he could think about was how wrong everything had gone. This wasn't supposed to happen. A family torn apart by lies, greed, and hatred. The uncle had pushed them to this point, but they had all played their parts. It was all their fault. The air was thick with the stench of gunpowder and blood. The youngest son felt his body growing colder with each passing second. His thoughts became disjointed, memories slipping away. It felt like a nightmare, but it was real. And the nightmare was only beginning. The youngest son's mind swirled in a haze of confusion. His body no longer obeyed his commands. Every breath felt like it could be his last. The cries of his family blended with the pounding in his ears. The darkness crept in faster, like a tide swallowing him whole. He could feel his brother's hands shaking as they pressed against his chest. Desperation. But there was nothing anyone could do. The uncle's laughter echoed through the house, cruel and hollow. His voice rang out again, taunting, mocking. "You thought you could stop me, didn't you?" The youngest son tried to open his mouth, but his words wouldn't come. The last thing he saw before his eyes closed was the shadow of the uncle moving toward the door. The house felt like it was collapsing. The door slammed shut, and the world outside went silent. No one knew what to do. The elder brother stood frozen, his hands still on his brother, but it was too late. He looked around, frantic, but there was no one left to help. His father lay dead on the floor, his blood staining the wood beneath him. The air was thick with death. The house, once a home, was now a crime scene. And the walls would forever hold the secrets of a family torn apart by its own darkness. The eldest brother could feel his heart pounding in his chest. He looked at the lifeless body of his brother, the once strong bond between them now shattered. And in that silence, he made a choice. He would make sure the uncle paid. The night stretched on, heavy with dread. Outside, the world seemed unaffected, as if nothing had happened. But inside, everything had changed forever. And the story of this twisted massacre would be written in blood. The eldest brother stood, numb and trembling, his thoughts a blur. He looked at his father, still sprawled on the cold floor, lifeless. The man who had raised him, who had tried to keep them together, was gone. The youngest son, his sibling, lay beside him, a tragic mirror of their father's fate. Grief weighed down on him, but a cold rage began to grow. He couldn't leave things like this. He couldn't let the uncle get away. With shaky hands, he reached for the gun his father had once kept in the drawer. His fingers brushed the cold metal, and for a moment, he hesitated. He wasn't sure what he was doing, but the anger inside him surged. The house was silent except for the distant creak of the walls, as if the structure itself mourned. He lifted the gun, his eyes narrowing. His mind screamed for vengeance, for justice. But deep inside, he wasn't sure what justice even meant anymore. The uncle had done this. He had destroyed them. The entire family, reduced to ruins. The eldest brother took a slow step toward the door, the weight of the gun heavy in his hand. He could hear the wind howling outside, but inside, the house was suffocating. He opened the door, and the cold air hit him like a slap to the face. He didn't know where his uncle had gone, but he had to find him. He had to end this. The world outside was dark, the streets eerily quiet, as though the universe had stopped to watch. Every shadow felt like a threat, every noise a warning. He moved quickly, his heart racing, his breath coming in short bursts. His mind was focused on one thing: revenge. He reached the edge of the property, the barn looming in the distance. The uncle had to be there. The eldest brother's footsteps were loud in the night, the crunch of gravel beneath his boots deafening. He paused, his chest tightening with fear, but he pushed it down. He couldn't stop now. He had to see this through. The barn was just ahead, its door cracked open, a sliver of light spilling out. The eldest brother's hand tightened on the gun. He was close now. So close. The barn door creaked as the eldest brother pushed it open, his breath sharp in the cold night air. The darkness inside was thick, broken only by the faint sliver of light that escaped from the cracks in the wood. He stepped inside, the silence pressing in on him like a weight. His footsteps echoed, bouncing off the old wooden walls. His eyes darted around, searching the shadows, heart pounding in his chest. He could feel the tension in the air, like a storm about to break. The barn smelled of hay, old leather, and something else, something metallic. Blood. A flicker of movement caught his eye in the corner of the barn. He froze. There, crouching low, was his uncle. His figure was barely visible in the shadows, but the malicious grin on his face was unmistakable. The eldest brother's grip tightened around the gun, his fingers stiff with rage. "You thought you could stop me, didn't you?" The uncle's voice slithered out from the darkness, taunting. The eldest brother's chest tightened. "Why? Why did you do it?" he demanded, his voice low and steady, though his hands trembled. The uncle chuckled, a sickening sound. "It's all part of the game," he sneered. "You never understood, did you? This family was never meant to survive. It was all just a matter of time before it all fell apart." The eldest brother's mind reeled, but he couldn't afford to be distracted. His vision was clouded by rage. The uncle stood slowly, his silhouette menacing in the dim light. "You really think you can take me down? You've already lost. Look at what you've become. Just like me." The eldest brother took a step forward, his breath shaky but his resolve firm. "I won't let you destroy any more of us," he muttered, voice breaking through the suffocating tension. The uncle's laugh grew louder, crueler. "You're too late," he hissed. And in that instant, the eldest brother knew. The game wasn't over yet. It was only just beginning. The barn door slammed shut behind him with a deafening thud. Everything went black. The darkness swallowed him whole. His heart pounded in his chest, the sound echoing in his ears. The barn was eerily silent now, save for the ragged breaths escaping from both men. The eldest brother's eyes had adjusted, and he could make out the faint outline of his uncle, standing tall, a figure of malevolent calm. A sudden, sharp movement broke the stillness, a flash of metal gleaming in the dim light. The uncle's hand tightened around a blade, its edge catching the faint glow of the barn. "Is this what you want?" The uncle's voice was calm, almost mocking. "A final showdown?" The eldest brother gritted his teeth. He couldn't afford to show fear. He raised the gun, his hands shaking slightly as the weight of it settled in his palm. "Enough," he spat. "It ends tonight." But even as the words left his lips, the uncle lunged. The blade sliced through the air, and the eldest brother barely had time to react. The gunshot rang out, deafening and sharp. The uncle staggered, the blade falling from his hand. The eldest brother's heart stopped for a moment as he watched the man he once feared fall to his knees. The uncle's hand gripped his side, where blood seeped out in dark patches, staining his shirt. He looked up with wide eyes, his lips twisted in shock. "Well, what have you done?" he gasped. The eldest brother's breath was ragged. "I did what had to be done." His voice was low, hollow. He couldn't believe what he had just done. His eyes locked with the uncle's, and for a long moment, the world seemed to stand still. The uncle's breath came in shallow gasps, and he collapsed onto the cold barn floor, a pool of blood quickly spreading beneath him. The eldest brother stared at him, the weight of his actions finally sinking in. But the uncle didn't speak again. His body went limp, his final breath barely a whisper in the air. The eldest brother dropped the gun to his side, his hands trembling uncontrollably. He stood there, numb, as the silence settled over the barn once more. Everything had changed. But the nightmare wasn't over. Not yet. The eldest brother stood frozen in place, his mind reeling. The barn, once a place of life and work, now felt like a tomb. The uncle's body lay still, lifeless, the blood slowly pooling beneath him. The gun hung loosely in his hand, as if it were foreign to him now. His heart pounded in his chest, each beat a loud reminder of the price of what he had just done. He had ended it. The pain. The years of resentment. The family torn apart by greed and betrayal. But what had he truly gained? The silence was deafening. He couldn't escape the feeling that he had lost something far more important than just his uncle. As he stood over the body, a sense of dread began to creep in. He wasn't sure if it was the weight of the act or the realization of what came next. What now? The world outside the barn seemed 1,000 miles away. He could still hear the faint wind howling in the distance, but everything else was muffled, as if a thick fog had settled over him. A movement caught his eye, and he turned quickly, his pulse spiking. But it was only the barn door creaking in the wind, swaying open just a crack. For a moment he thought about leaving, about walking away from this nightmare, leaving it all behind. But he couldn't. The family was broken beyond repair. And in the dark corners of his mind, He knew this would haunt him forever. He had thought killing his uncle would bring him peace, but instead, it left a void, an emptiness he hadn't anticipated. He looked down at the blood-stained floor, the sight almost too much to bear. For a brief moment, he almost wished he could turn back time, that he could undo the events that led him here. But it was too late for regrets now. He had crossed a line from which there was no return. As the cold night air seeped in through the cracks, the eldest brother took one last, lingering look at his uncle's body. Then, without a word, he turned and walked out of the barn, leaving the past behind.
But the past
wasn't done with him. Not yet. The eldest brother stepped into the night, the cool air biting at his skin. The barn door creaked shut behind him, and he was swallowed by the darkness. His footsteps were heavy, each one carrying the weight of the family's downfall. He didn't know where he was going or if he was going anywhere at all. His mind was a storm of thoughts, none of them clear. The moon above was barely visible through the thick clouds, casting only a faint light on the land. The silence around him was suffocating, broken only by the sound of his own breathing. He walked aimlessly, the weight of his actions pressing on his chest like a vice. The cold, empty farm stretched before him, a reflection of everything he had lost. His home, his family, all of it was gone now. He felt a strange numbness settle over him, as though the events of the night hadn't really happened, or perhaps they had happened to someone else. But the blood on his hands was real. The echoes of the gunshot still rang in his ears. The eldest brother stopped in his tracks, his gaze falling on the horizon. Far off in the distance, he could see the faint lights of the town. It seemed so distant now, so irrelevant. He hadn't even thought about what to do next. There was no one left to turn to, no one to call for help. The only family he had left was the pain, the grief that would follow him wherever he went. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. He had won the fight, but at what cost? His uncle was dead, but the family was shattered. Nothing could bring them back together. Nothing could undo the blood that had been spilled. And as he stood there, staring into the distance, the weight of everything seemed to crash down on him all at once. He didn't know if he could live with it. The nightmare that had begun with a feud between relatives was now his reality. He turned back toward the barn, the familiar scent of hay and wood still lingering in the air. But it wasn't home anymore. It was just another broken piece of the past. A past that would never be whole again. And as the eldest brother walked back toward the place where it all ended, he knew there was no redemption waiting for him. There was only the long, dark road ahead. The eldest brother moved slowly, his steps dragging as if the weight of the world had settled on his shoulders. His mind was numb, but there was a gnawing emptiness inside him. He could hear the distant rustle of leaves, the wind whispering through the trees, but it all seemed so far away. He reached the barn once more, standing in the doorway. The silence inside was suffocating, the faintest trace of blood still staining the wooden floor. He stepped back into the darkness, the heavy air pressing against his chest. The barn felt smaller now, as if it had swallowed everything alive within it. He couldn't bring himself to look at his uncle's body again. But something pulled him forward. Some deep, primal need to confront the past, even if it would destroy him. His fingers brushed the cold metal of the gun still gripped in his hand, but it felt foreign, like something he could never undo. The sound of his own breathing was deafening in the confined space. Everything was closing in on him. The walls, the memories, the choices. He hadn't expected it to be like this. In his mind, he had thought the act would bring clarity, a sense of finality. But now, standing there in the barn, he felt more lost than ever. A distant sound broke the quiet. It was faint, barely a whisper, but it made his heart skip a beat. Footsteps. He spun around, instinctively raising the gun, but there was nothing there. The shadows played tricks on his mind, but he knew he wasn't alone. His body stiffened, his grip tightening. He could feel it in his bones. Something was wrong. And then, out of the corner of his eye, he saw a movement. A figure stepped out from the dark corner of the barn. It wasn't his uncle. It wasn't anyone he knew. It was a stranger.
Tall. Thin.
The silhouette barely visible in the dim light. But there was no mistaking the look in the figure's eyes.
Cold.
Calculating. The eldest brother's breath caught in his throat. "Who are you?" His voice cracked, the fear creeping back into his chest. The figure didn't answer. Instead, they took a step forward, the floorboards creaking beneath their feet. The eldest brother's instincts screamed at him to run, but his feet were rooted to the ground. He wasn't sure what was happening, but something told him it wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The stranger's eyes locked onto his, unblinking. And with a slow, deliberate motion, the figure reached into their coat pocket. The eldest brother's heart stopped. He wasn't alone anymore. This wasn't the end. It was just the beginning of something far darker. The figure's hand emerged from the pocket, gripping something tightly. The eldest brother's pulse quickened as the shadowy figure pulled out a small, sleek device. Nothing that resembled a weapon, but something more sinister. A phone. The stranger held it out, as if offering it to him, the screen glowing faintly in the dim light. The eldest brother stared at it, his mind racing. What was this? Without a word, the figure turned the phone toward him, the screen flickering to life. There, in the dim glow, the eldest brother saw a video. His heart stopped. It was a recording of the night. Of everything. Of the gunshot. The moment his uncle collapsed. The blood pooling on the floor. It was all there. His hands trembled as he reached for the phone, the reality of the situation crashing down on him. A quiet, cold voice came from behind the stranger. "You thought you'd be the last one standing, didn't you?" The eldest brother's head snapped up, eyes wide. But there was no one else in sight. The stranger stepped closer, the air growing colder with each step. "You didn't think you'd be the only one, did you?" The figure continued, voice smooth, almost amused. The eldest brother could feel the weight of the words pressing against his chest, suffocating him. He could barely breathe. "Your family was never meant to survive, remember? None of you were," the figure said, eyes gleaming with a cold intensity. The eldest brother's mind reeled, trying to process what was happening. The video. The voice. Was there someone else involved in all of this? Had they been watching him this whole time? The figure smiled, a twisted grin spreading across their face. "You were always meant to be part of a bigger game." The eldest brother's head was spinning. His hands were clammy with sweat as he slowly backed away. "Who are you?" he whispered, his voice shaking. The stranger didn't answer immediately. Instead, they held up the phone again, showing him a series of still images now, photos of the family. The father. His brother. And there in the middle of it all, was a familiar face. The eldest brother himself. But not from the last few days. This was from years ago. The young boy who had grown up in the house. The figure's grin widened. "You really think your family was just some accident of fate? You were all pawns?" His heart raced, dread flooding his veins. Who had been watching them all these years? And why hadn't he seen it coming? Everything had felt wrong, but now the truth was impossible to ignore. The game wasn't over. It had only just begun. The eldest brother felt his blood run cold. The truth was unraveling in front of him, like a twisted knot pulling tighter with each passing moment. He could barely breathe as the figure continued to speak, each word like a hammer striking him harder. His mind reeled with disbelief. "Pawns," he whispered, barely able to get the word out. The stranger nodded slowly, an eerie calm in their eyes. "You were all expendable, part of a plan far older than you know. A family destined to break, fractured by greed and hidden motives." The eldest brother's head spun. Everything, the years of resentment, the years of fighting, the bloodshed, had all been part of a game. A game he never even realized he was playing. "You're nothing more than a piece in a puzzle, brother," The figure continued, their voice soft but chilling. Your uncle wasn't the mastermind. He was just another player. The eldest brother's stomach churned, his thoughts racing. His hands gripped the phone, but his body was numb. His uncle had been part of a larger conspiracy, a web of deception and manipulation that stretched back years. But who could have orchestrated something like this? And why had he been so blind to it? The stranger's smile faded, their eyes growing darker. There are others. You're not alone in this. You'll find that out soon enough. The eldest brother took a shaky step back, the weight of their words pressing in on him. The game wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The stranger tilted their head, as if they were savoring the moment. You've lost more than you know. But this is just the beginning. With a swift motion, the figure turned and disappeared into the shadows, vanishing into the night like a ghost. The eldest brother stood there, frozen, the phone still clutched in his hand. Everything he thought he knew was a lie. The family, his uncle's death, his own role in it all. The truth was darker, deeper than he could have ever imagined. As the cold wind howled through the barn, the eldest brother sank to his knees, the weight of his actions and the terror of what lay ahead crashing over him. He had crossed a line that could never be undone. And now, the real nightmare was just beginning. The eldest brother sat motionless in the dark barn, the cold seeping into his bones. His hands shook as he stared at the phone, still lit with images and unsettling messages. The stranger's words echoed in his mind. You've lost more than you know. But this is just the beginning. But what could he possibly do now? The world had changed. His life, his family, had been torn apart in ways he couldn't understand, let alone fix. He had once believed he was protecting them, his father, his brother, his family. But now, it felt like he was trapped in a nightmare of his own making, a nightmare from which there was no escape. The gun was still heavy in his grip, but it felt like a weight too great to carry. A symbol of the things he had done, the things he had destroyed, all in the name of saving them. But who was he really saving? The barn, the family home, all felt so distant now. His family wasn't just gone, they were lost to a game they never even knew they were playing. A game of deceit, manipulation, and lies, where no one was ever safe. His breath came in shallow bursts, the cold air stinging his lungs, and yet he couldn't find the strength to move. He had thought that killing his uncle would bring peace, but it had only opened a door to a deeper darkness, one that he didn't know how to fight. The door creaked open behind him. For a split second, he thought it was the stranger again, or maybe someone else coming to finish what had been started. But as he turned, he was met with nothing but the wind, blowing through the cracks of the barn, stirring the dust into the air. There would be no more voices, no more answers. He was truly alone now. The eldest brother stood, taking one last look at the barn, at the blood-stained floor that had once been the heart of the family. Everything had led him here, to this moment. He stepped outside, his body heavy with exhaustion, but his mind still racing. There was no going back. As he walked into the night, he understood, with chilling clarity, that the game was not over. It had only just begun. And as the cold wind whipped around him, he realized something deeper still. In the end, the greatest battle was not with his uncle or anyone else, but with himself. The storm was within, and he had no idea how it would end.